Hey YouTubers, welcome back to the Piper's Mantle. Even though the first book in my fantasy series is yet to be published, it was suggested to me that I start promoting my work. Therefore, I have decided to make a video series which will go into great detail about the fantasy world I've created, along with its history, mythology, and of course its inhabitants. In this first video, I would like to talk about how this endeavour began, what inspired me, and what the first book in my fantasy series is about. The art of writing was a gift that became apparent in the early part of my childhood. Every night before bed, my grandmother would read to me. She started with nursery rhymes and fairy tales. Then, at the age of 5, when I began to attend St George Christian School at Sans Souci, she moved on to biblical stories. These stories fueled my imagination. In fact, I still have a few of the books she read to me when I was a child, having recently discovered them in the back of a closet, which brought back a lot of memories. My grandmother planted the seed for my writing, but ironically it wasn't a book that watered the seed of my desire to write truth through fantasy, but a television series. And even though I didn't get my hands on the books they were based on until I was a teenager, it was the BBC's adaptation of the Chronicles of Narnia that entered my soul and refused to leave. Despite the biblical stories I had heard, no other character to me resembled Christ more than Narnia's Aslan. This was the seed that would awaken within me as an adult 20 years later. But it would take something special to awaken that which had been asleep for so long, and that awakening came when I discovered George MacDonald's Fantastes, a Fairy Romance for Men and Women. No other book has had a greater impact on my life and my writing, and I was shocked to learn that C.S. Lewis, the author of the Chronicles of Narnia, experienced a similar awakening when he picked up Fantastes at a train station bookstall. Having been greatly inspired by George MacDonald's writing and theology, Lewis came to regard him as his spiritual master. With the seed sprouting and my mind blown open by Fantastes, all I could think about was writing my own work of fantasy, something that would reach people on a spiritual level. Time passed, but I still hadn't written anything. Then I rediscovered J.R.R. Tolkien's The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings trilogy, which greatly influenced my desire to write something based on biblical mythology. I wanted to create something with the enchantment of Fantastes, the magic of Narnia, and some of the grandeur of the Lord of the Rings. For C.S. Lewis, it all started with a picture in his head, a picture of a faun carrying an umbrella and walking through a snowy wood. For me, it also started with a picture of an elf maiden sitting in a field of blue flowers by the edge of a stream with a picnic basket beside her. From there, the story continued to play out in my mind as a fairy tale, but there was a missing component, the component of an unlikely hero in the form of a shopping mall security guard who inadvertently enters the world of Eloria. His name is Jack Campbell, and his security experiences are based on my own experiences, having endured more than a decade in the industry, with most of those years spent working in shopping centres throughout the city of Sydney, Australia. In fact, at the beginning of the book, Jack attends an incident inside a chemist store that actually happened. It was the first incident I ever attended, and I couldn't help but include it in the story to blur the lines between fantasy and reality. The following photograph is the only one I have of me in my security uniform, so please, try not to laugh. You're laughing right now, aren't you? That's okay, it is a funny picture. Anyway, I wanted Jack Campbell to be an unlikely hero, an average Joe, a flawed human being like the rest of us but with a strong sense of justice. When exposed to the world of Eloria, however, Jack finds a strength he never knew he had. The first book is about establishing the main character as he discovers the world of Eloria, and by the time Jack arrives on the scene, Eloria has been inhabited for 4,323 years. During that time, the elves and dwarves have survived the Great War, when the Red Dragon and his army entered Eloria. They have also survived the 500 Years' War, when the orcs united and tried to conquer the land. But with the arrival of the last Shadar, the inhabitants of Eloria will face their greatest challenge, for Jack's arrival is indeed a sign of dark days ahead, but there's a light at the end of the tunnel. For readers to understand the character of Jack Campbell, he must first be introduced in the human world, where he works as a security guard at a local shopping centre. But when Jack is passed over for a promotion, he realises that his efforts throughout his decade-long security career have all been for naught. Fed up with the false promises of his employer, Jack quits his job in dramatic fashion. When he returns home, he begins to suffer what can only be described as a nervous breakdown. So in order to clear his head, Jack goes for a walk in the local national park. The reader is then treated to some descriptive writing as Jack walks through the Australian bush, hearing the sounds of native birds such as the laughing kookaburra. Jack is not unfamiliar with this bushland, having visited the area in the past, but when he hears the sound of something foreign in the form of running water, his natural curiosity drives him towards it. In the twinkling of an eye, Jack's surroundings suddenly change from what used to be Australian bush to something that resembles a pristine European woodland. And when he comes upon a clearing of wild blue flowers, Jack finds the source of the running water when he spots a beautiful maiden sitting by a stream with a picnic basket beside her. He soon introduces himself and learns that her name is Serena. But a twist is revealed when Serena not only claims to be an elf, but that she's been waiting for him. Eventually, Jack accepts Serena as his guide as she leads him down a path on the other side of the clearing, taking him deeper into the forest. The forest is an enchanted one, known as the Forest of the Fairy Queen. As they continue to converse, Serena leads him to an old rustic cabin. The cabin is quite beautiful and is home to the most famous wizard in Eloria, a powerful seer called 𝐏𝐢𝐻𝐸𝐸. Expecting to meet an imposing figure, Jack is surprised when the cabin door opens to reveal a tiny, 3-foot-tall dwarf with a pipe of burning tobacco clenched between his teeth. The wizard informs Jack that his arrival was foretold long ago and that he was destined to enter this world of enchantment, destined to be the last 𝐏𝐢𝐻𝐸𝐸. Following a brief encounter with some fairies, Jack, Serena and the dwarf wizard 𝐏𝐢𝐻𝐸𝐸 travel together through the forest until they arrive at Eloria's capital, the Sapphire City. There is a lot of descriptive writing as Jack becomes familiar with the various terrain and construction elements of the buildings. Being the only human in the world full of elves, dwarves, fairies and other beings, Jack is forced to adapt to his new environment. At first he's like a fish out of water, but his fear of the unknown is no less than his sense of adventure, and Eloria offers Jack an escape from his mundane life. As the story progresses, Jack meets with Eloria's High Council and learns about the culture of the elves and their history, a history so vast that I couldn't possibly fit it into this video. However, I do plan on revealing some of that history in the second video of this Introducing Eloria series. At this point in the story, the plot is continuing to flow, but at the same time there is some secrecy around it, because the main character still doesn't know why he's been chosen by a higher power to enter Eloria. But not everyone's happy about the arrival of a human, and as the division caused by Jack's presence continues to grow, some of the elves take matters into their own hands, which may result in a great betrayal, leading to the deaths of innocent civilians. Jack has many allies, and most of the elves believe the prophecy about him, and after training as a squire for several months, his new skills are put to the test in a great battle where he has to defend himself against several foes, including the main antagonist, the deadly entity known as the Shadow Man. However, Jack's greatest challenge comes in the form not of an enemy, but in the form of a world-altering decision when he is finally told why he was brought to Eloria. If Jack makes the wrong choice, then the world he has come to love may be destroyed. To help him make the right decision, Jack seeks help from the fairies and is led to the gateway to Arethusa, a world with a dark history, and when he discovers the true nature of fairies, Jack may never make it back to Eloria alive. Henry David Thoreau once said, "The mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation." Jack is someone who never really found his place in the human world, but the more time he spends in Eloria, the more like an Elorian he begins to feel. In fact, at one point near the end of the book, Jack comes to realise that his life before Eloria had very little meaning. By the end of the book, Jack has established himself as a heroic figure yet to endure more obstacles, foes and battles, as he fights to save a world he's become very fond of and a people he has come to love. To set up the second book in the series, the last page reveals a cliffhanger, one that I hope will leave you hungry for more. I think readers will be happy with the world-building elements in conjunction with the plot. For example, when you read J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, you can tell that he was more interested in the world-building aspects of his series than he was about the various plots. Which makes sense because Tolkien created an entire language before he wrote the books. I wanted my book to have lots of world-building elements, but I didn't want them to overshadow the plot. Ultimately, it will be up to readers to decide if I have accomplished this. Even though this book will be published under the genre of Christian fantasy, it's considered to be more edgy. Some of the themes are quite dark, like when Jack encounters the gateway to Arethusa. The fairies of Arethusa are not like Tinkerbell from Peter Pan. They are based on Celtic and Greek mythology and have a much darker history. The book also contains several battles which are quite brutal, so it's definitely not for children. Because this book is Christian themed, I think it will be enjoyed by adults of the Christian faith or enjoyed by those who don't mind reading works of fiction which contain Christian themes, messages and allegories. Yet some of the most popular works of fantasy contain Christian themes, like Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings and C.S. Lewis's The Chronicles of Narnia. Given the choice, I would actually prefer it if non-Christians read my work, because, like George MacDonald, I believe that truth through fantasy has the potential to awaken things in people which they otherwise wouldn't have known were there. By taking the reader into a fantasy world where they don't have prejudices, it opens the door for spiritual themes to be explored. The initial series of the Tribulations of Eloria will be 7 books. I'm also hoping to write a prequel trilogy, some standalone books, and maybe some short stories, all of which will be based on my fantasy world with its vast history and extensive mythology, which, as mentioned before, will be discussed in the second video of what will be a 4-part video series. With so many books yet to be written, you may be asking, how am I going to accomplish this? Well, J.R.R. Tolkien stated that he began with maps and then developed his plots from them. So in order for there to be enough material, I must have a map that's big enough to include the various plots, history and mythology of Eloria. And while many of these elements are still under construction, I did indeed commission a map which was featured in some of my previous videos. The world of Eloria is one of fantasy but framed in theology, with many of the towns and kingdoms having been named after biblical ones. Some, of course, are quite original but not arbitrary, with some locations named after certain words outside the English language and other locations named after or used to reference some of my favourite authors. For example, the town of Tollersville has been named after J.R.R. Tolkien, and the towns of Arundel and Aberdeen, which were based on those in the United Kingdom, were significant places in the life of Scottish author George MacDonald. In Book 1, I'm hoping to include the following image, which is a tribute to Christian author C.S. Lewis by the inclusion of a Narnia-style lamppost with a simultaneous tribute to George MacDonald in the form of a tavern sign featured in the background, which is clearly a reference to his short story, The Golden Key. Taverns, inns and alehouses feature prominently in the cities and towns of Eloria, with one described in the book that's clearly a tribute to Tolkien's character Gandalf in the form of an inn called the Wandering Wizard. George MacDonald, C.S. Lewis and the works of J.R.R. Tolkien have had such an impact on my life that I couldn't help but pay each of them a tribute throughout my story. Yet there is no town or location in Eloria that's been named with haste. The first draft of this map was created by me over 6 years ago using a standard paint program combined with some clip art. I then commissioned a more professional version of the map from a digital artist who would then go on to create the internal art for Book 1, but not before producing a colorized version of the map as well. One thing that's always bothered me about Tolkien's map and others like it was the lack of visible snowline, an effect which can only be accomplished through colorization. Therefore, my digital artist was able to colorize a duplicate copy, revealing the snow-covered areas while also giving readers an alternative map of Eloria in all its colourful glory. Book 1 takes place between the Southern Gate and the Sapphire City, with the main character making brief trips to Mugglegruff's cabin and the gateway to Arethusa. So as you can see, there is still a substantial amount of Eloria yet to be explored. In the second video of this series, which is called Introducing Eloria Part 2, Creation, Mythology and History, you will discover how Eloria was created, how the inhabitants of it came to be, and how the elves and dwarves battled the forces of evil to save their world of enchantment.